Tiếp theo sau đây, tôi xin trân trọng giới thiệu Professor Richard Hunt sẽ có 2 bài báo cáo.
And I'd like to express my thanks to Takeda for their kindness in supporting my visit to Vietnam, which is my first visit to this lovely country. And I'm really very happy and pleased to be here. I'd also like to thank Bin An, who's in translating for me for the last 2 meetings and also today. This is a demanding task, I know, and his translations have been very good as far as his translation of Vietnamese into English is concerned, and I'm sure he's equally good in translating English into Vietnamese for you in the audience. I was asked to talk about reflux disease and acid secretion in particular, and you will see here Victoria Falls, rather Niagara Falls, which is very close to my university in Canada, and on the right is the medical centre at McMaster, and you'll see that it's in the autumn at this time of the year when the colours of the trees in Canada are just quite spectacular. We have a lot of maple trees which look wonderful at the end of the summer. So I'm going to start by my conflicts of interest, and then the outline of my talk, which is going to be an introduction to anti-secretory treatments, particularly the proton pump inhibitors, and the limitations of the first generation of these drugs. I'm going to talk about the new generation of PPIs and also take a very brief look at the new class of anti-secretory drugs, the PCABs, or potassium channel acid blocking drugs, particularly vonoprazan, which will likely be introduced here in Vietnam at the end of next year. And I can illustrate where these newer drugs can answer some of the unmet needs in reflux disease, and then in the second talk I'll mention similarly where they can have a role in H. pylori eradication. There's been an interest from medical scientists for centuries in the digestive properties of the gastric juice, and it was in 1828 that William Prout, who was a family physician in rural parts of England, who analysed gastric juice and was able to define this as being hydrochloric acid. And that was the beginning of a very much more focused interest in the physiology of gastric acid secretion, which has resulted in highly targeted pharmacological agents to control acid secretion. And the first of these was the discovery by James Black in 1972 of the histamine H2 receptor and the molecules which could block that. Firstly burimamide, then metiamide, and then cimetidine, which was the first commercial drug which really controlled acid secretion very effectively. And you will note by the trade name of Tagamet, it was pretty much the same name all around the world at that time. And that drug was incredibly effective for duodenal ulcer, which was of course before we had discovered Helicobacter pylori. And that drug alone virtually abolished the need for gastric surgery for peptic ulcer disease. However, that drug was not particularly good for managing patients with reflux. And we'll be saying a lot more about how the subsequent drugs have been so much more effective. And it was John Forte and George Sachs who each were working on the acid pump or the proton pump, and were able to define the molecular structure of the pump and show how this could be blocked by the drugs that we now call the proton pump inhibitors, or the PPIs. And so if we then think about the control of acid secretion, most of you here will, at medical school, have learned about the control of acid secretion by gastrin and by the vagal control, effectively working through the ECL cell, which releases histamine, and how there's an inhibitory factor of somatostatin. And that seemed to be a fairly straightforward and simple way of thinking of acid secretion. However, it's infinitely more complicated than that, because there are many mediators which also influence acid secretion locally. And these are mediators which are released within the mucosa of the stomach. And you'll see there are a lot of them. And then in addition to that, there's the microbiome of the stomach, which is primarily Helicobacter pylori, but not exclusively. And both LPS from the cell wall of H. pylori and bacterial products which are produced by organisms lead to inflammation, which, as a consequence of the influx of immunocytes into that area, causes inflammation, with the release of many mediators of those inflammatory cells, which also will influence acid secretion locally within the stomach. So this is a very complex area, and we need to bear this in mind when we think about what's going on in the stomach and why drugs are not necessarily always doing what we expect them to do. We're targeting acid secretion from the parietal cell, and the simplest approach, which goes back to the time of the ancient Greeks, where they crushed coral into powdered coral and effectively used that for dyspepsia, which is a Greek word. And that is, of course, how antacids are working, by neutralizing acid which is being secreted into the stomach in the fundus. And then the H2 receptor antagonists are blocking the H2 receptor at this site, which of course is not the final pathway of acid secretion. And one of the problems about blocking the H2 receptor, this is a cyclic AMP linked receptor, and you can get upregulation. And this has been a problem, and it remains a problem when we use H2 receptor antagonists together with proton pump inhibitors, that we may get upregulation or tachyphylaxis. The proton pump inhibitors are targeting the hydrogen potassium ATPase in the proton pump, where it is inserted into the wall of the secretory canaliculus. And they block the secretion out of hydrogen ion, whereas the new generation of PCABs blocks the ingress of potassium through the potassium channel into the cell, because the pump is effectively sending hydrogen ions out and bringing potassium in exchange into the cell, in exchange for that hydrogen ion secretion. A very sophisticated little pump system, and we now have the ability to target both parts of that pathway. And I'll say a little bit more about that when we get to talk about the PCABs. Now, in talking about reflux disease, there are two important definitions that we have to consider. Firstly, the definition of gastroesophageal reflux disease, but also that of non-erosive reflux disease. The definition of GERD that we rely on is that from 2005, which was the Montreal definition. and is defined as a condition which develops when the reflux of stomach contents causes troublesome symptoms and/or complications. And this was the first time we had a definition of reflux disease, which also considered the presence of conditions which we now call extraesophageal syndromes. And I'll say a little bit more about that towards the end of the talk. The definition of NERD was devised at a consensus meeting which was held at Vevey in Switzerland. And NERD is important because you, as practitioners, you hear a lot about it, you read a lot about it, but in reality it's a bit of a nonsense. Because to define something by the lack of, or the fact of something not being present is not particularly easy if you're sitting in a consulting room with somebody who's sitting opposite you. And particularly if you're then, as say, a family physician or a non-gastroenterologist, being expected to consider a diagnosis which by its very definition requires an endoscopy to have been done in order to categorize the patient. So this is in fact patients who would otherwise be considered as part of the GERD spectrum, but who've had an endoscopy. They're the same group in terms of having troublesome symptoms, but when we look with the endoscope, the lining of the esophagus is entirely normal. We don't see any mucosal breaks or any erosions or inflammation. But that's using conventional endoscopy. And if we were using one of the modern generation of endoscopes that we have now, where we can put a magnifying lens, switch on a magnifying lens, to be able to look at the surface lining of the esophagus in more detail, we might see abnormalities which wouldn't be seen by a conventional endoscope. So we're moving into an era where we may be able to define things in this group of patients that we haven't up till now. And that's particularly true because some of the endoscopes which we have available are able to provide for us what we call an optical biopsy. They, in fact, electronically can look several microns below the surface of those cells. And when we do that, you can see that the cells are somewhat different. They may be more separated, that they're increased intercellular spaces. And certainly, if we take biopsies from this group of patients, we may see under an electron microscope that the intercellular spaces are dilated. And this is important because these are the differences that may or may not be relevant. So we can have supportive evidence for this condition, but clinically we still tend to wish to separate out our patients into this particular group of non-erosive. But we have to separate both of these two categories I've just described from functional heartburn. Functional heartburn is a condition that we really don't know exactly what the causes are, but we know it's a disturbance of visceral perception in which there is hyperalgesia or greater sensitivity in those patients to a variety of stimulus. So, for example, if I take a group of patients with functional heartburn and I pass a balloon into their esophagus and blow it up, and I compare that with a bunch of normal healthy controls, the people with functional heartburn will detect the balloon pressure at a much lower pressure than will the healthy control population. So that group of functional heartburn patients are more sensitive to a particular stimulus. That's particularly true of balloon inflation, but it's also true of electrical stimuli that we can do as well. And so we think that some people may experience hypersensitivity to certain characteristics of food. And some of these people, when we biopsy them, do have increased intercellular spaces. One should say that this dilated intercellular space, while it's commonly reported in people with reflux disease, may occur in healthy people as well. So this is not a strong differentiating factor. But when we, again, stimulate within the esophagus with a balloon or electrically, we do see different signals on electroencephalogram recordings undertaken at the same time. So that there is a difference, there are differences in corticocerebral processing in these patients. In general terms, these people will not respond to acid suppression because there's no evidence that acid is getting into the esophagus. In fact, by definition, acid reflux is not involved, and therefore we have to determine that. And in my personal experience, the best treatment is usually something like a low-dose tricyclic antidepressant. So something like amitriptyline at very low dose, maybe 12.5 milligrams a night, a much lower dose than one would typically use as an antidepressant. We know that reflux disease is increasing in Asia. Prevalent studies of GERD symptoms and reflux esophagitis have been shown generally higher figures compared to previously published studies. Studies have been published previously by K.O. Go from Kuala Lumpur and Benjamin Wong from Hong Kong. And the most recent studies do show an increase on those earlier studies reported. And the time trend studies now show an increase in symptoms of GERD in community and also an increase in studies where endoscopy has been performed looking at the prevalence of esophagitis with erosive disease. And when we look at the figures in general, GERD prevalence is about 5% in Asia, as opposed to 10 to 20% when we look at reports from the Western world. And for symptoms, it's about 2.5 to 20% in Asia, depending on where these reports have come from. And they're up to about 30% in Europe and North America. Now, one of the difficulties is the word heartburn, because this is not a condition or a word or term that translates easily across languages or across cultures. And the fact that the word involves heart gives some patients in some parts of the world concern when you start talking to them about whether they have heartburn or not, because they get concerned and anxious that you're talking about something being wrong with their heart as opposed to something that's actually related to their digestive system. And in our group in Nebraska, we've been exploring the use of pictograms so that we can show a patient a series of pictures and ask them if they can identify their symptoms with pictures. And this is quite important in a place like Canada because almost everybody in Canada is an immigrant from somewhere. If they're not first generation, they're likely to be second or third generation. And many will still be living culturally in a way that is similar to the country from which they came, whether they came from Latin America, or whether they came from, say, the Ukraine, or whether they come from somewhere in Asia. And of course, we have many people who've come from Vietnam over the last 50 years in Canada. And so we're trying to see whether the use of pictograms is going to be better than using words which may be linguistically and culturally difficult for patients. So what about gastroesophageal reflux and upper GI symptoms? The reality is that in our clinical practice, we are tending to deal with the presenting symptoms. And we have to make a diagnosis on the basis of the symptoms. And that's the reality in most healthcare systems. And reflux symptoms are not sensitive and they're not specific. And as we've already heard from the very nice presentation by Professor Duke, there's a huge amount of overlap and potential confusion between reflux symptoms and other things that are going on. And it's important to bear in mind that part of the problem is also that somebody who has reflux disease may have other things going on at the same time. Professor Duke showed us one or two scenarios in which serious disease was going on, and hopefully we will detect those in some way by elements in the alarm symptoms that will alert us to be asking for an endoscopy or a CT scan or abdominal ultrasound or whatever is the most appropriate. But there is also the presence of common conditions. So patients who have reflux symptoms, as we've heard, also might have dyspeptic symptoms, but they may also have irritable bowel syndrome. Irritable bowel syndrome and reflux disease are both very common. So it is no surprise that they will commonly be present in the same patient. And it's very important that we try to ask the patient about all of the elements of their symptoms when we see them, if we're going to make a good diagnosis. Because the symptoms that we really want to try and understand for reflux are heartburn and regurgitation. Heartburn is the most useful one that we as gastroenterologists can elicit, because it is the most responsive to the primary treatment that we're going to be using, which is an anti-secretory therapy. The relationship between heartburn and acid is much more predictive than any of the other symptoms, and I'll show you a bit about that in just a moment. And this is particularly important if a patient isn't doing well, because when they come back and you say to them, did the treatment work? If you're really lucky, they'll say, yes, I haven't had any heartburn at all, and it's worked really well. But if they come back and they say, I've still got some symptoms, it's really important that you say, well, what symptoms do you have? Because we don't expect altered bowel habits and abdominal bloating to be responding to the suppression of the acid. So if somebody does have IBS as well as the reflux symptoms for which you first saw them, their irritable bowel symptoms are going to continue unless you address them by other lifestyle or dietary advice. And this is really important when we think about whether the treatment is working or whether it's failing. So when we consider the symptoms of heartburn and regurgitation, they are the absolute key to our management. And we have therefore to evaluate the symptoms within the context of each particular patient and other things in their life, including their bowel habit, etc. So let me show you that symptoms are similar in patients with and without reflux esophagitis. So we can't actually consider that erosive esophagitis is more severe, or that we could pick it up on the symptoms. Here you can see that for the domains related to symptoms of esophagitis, with or without the inflammation of reflux, you will see that you can't detect for any of them there whether it's heartburn, whether it's regurgitation, whether it's nausea, whether it's abdominal pain, whether it's bloating, whether it's belching, or whether it's epigastric pain. And this is very important because there's no way that you can detect severity in any patient other than the patient telling you that it's the worst thing that they've ever had, or that it's stopping them doing everything in their life, or they can't speak because of it, or whatever it is. That's the way that we detect the severity, not because of this. And similarly, when we look at the grades of reflux esophagitis, the most severe, as you've already heard in the first presentation, C and D esophagitis are the erosive esophagitis. And here you can see that the proportion of, with each of these grades, will present with no heartburn, or only mild, moderate, or severe heartburn, are very similar between each of these groups. So again, it's the presence of the symptoms that you elicit rather than any one of them being helpful in telling us how severe it is or whether there's reflux esophagitis present. So what about some of the mechanisms that are involved in reflux disease? Well, we tend to accept that acid reflux is really the prerequisite for reflux disease. It's a prerequisite for all gastroesophageal reflux disease, and that also includes non-erosive disease. And we're thinking here about acidic reflux, and in the period between meals, the pH of the gastric contents is around 1.8 to 2, so it's very acidic. And what we try to do, as I'll show you shortly, is get the pH up to above 4 to get esophagitis to heal and for symptoms to be reduced. But it is important to appreciate that weakly acidic reflux will also produce symptoms in a number of people. There are a number of very good studies that have been done that show that if you put a catheter into the mid-esophagus and you drip test fluid into the esophagus at various pHs, the pHs between 4 and 7 will produce symptoms in a large proportion of reflux patients, but it will take longer to initiate those symptoms when the pH is higher, such as 5, 6 or 7. If you infuse at a pH of 2 or 3, the patient will experience the symptoms really very promptly. Workers in Glasgow have suggested that there is an acid pocket in reflux patients which sits at the top of the stomach, and that this is acid which is secreted after the meal, and if the meal has a lot of fat in it, the gastric juice will layer on the top of the fat layer at the top of the stomach, so that anything that refluxes, the acid will go first. And this is very elegant work, and it's quite consistent with how we imagine that strong acid can get into the esophagus and trigger symptoms. Now, one of the main problems with the sphincter mechanism at the lower esophageal sphincter is that you get transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxations. And will tend to damage the intercellular junctions, permitting the, for example, hydrogen ion to get back into the mucosa, but not only hydrogen ion, but also food antigens and other things that may cause a reactive or allergic response. And it is believed that in eosinophilic esophagitis there is an increased permeability of the distal esophagus, which may encourage the antigen to get into the esophagus and set up a reaction. And the other thing that we need to be taking into account now is the esophageal microbiome. And the esophagus has its own unique microbiome. This is very different to the microbiome in the small or the large intestine. It's quite similar to that in the stomach, and it also has a fairly close similarity to the oropharyngeal microbiome. It's important because we thought that everything that goes wrong in the esophagus in terms of reflux and esophagitis is a consequence of inflammation, which is a result of or caused by acid and digestive enzymes, pepsin and bile and pancreatic enzymes and so on, injuring the mucosa. But this suggests that other things could be going on. And we know that cytokines and other factors correlate with the histological changes in both erosive esophagitis and in NERD. And you can see that IL-1 beta and IL-8 transcripts are significantly higher in the cardia and the esophageal mucosa than in controls. And the levels are increased from control to NERD, and then the numbers rise in erosive esophagitis. And these histological stepwise increase in dilated intercellular spaces is also seen and tend to correlate with this cytokine or inflammatory response, as do the gene expressions. So this is raising different concepts. And an important paper was published 3 years ago from Stuart Spector's group, in which they looked at histology and saw typical histological changes of erosive esophagitis with basal cell and papillary hyperplasia, but where the surface of the esophageal epithelium was not eroded or damaged. And they reported a T lymphocyte predominant immunocyte infiltration deep in the mucosa, and suggest that what is going wrong is deep in the mucosa, and that is resulting in an unhealthy surface, and that the disease is originating within the mucosa rather than in the lumen and working downwards. We can raise the pH, the extent to which we can raise the pH, and also how long we treat for. And there's a dynamic interplay between the suppression, the degree of that suppression, and the duration of treatment. So if you've got much better acid suppression and a much longer control in the 24 hours, you can treat for a shorter time than if you have a weak acid suppression, in which case you may need to go out to 12 or 16 weeks. We also know that PPA reach the parietal cell, and then they cross the secretory canalicular membrane into the secretory space, where they become activated to sulfonamide derivatives, which then are extremely active and literally in a flash of time will bind covalently to parts of the proton pump. And when they do that, that pump is blocked for the life of that pump. But the thing that is important to know is that they will not block every pump in a parietal cell, because at any given moment in time, about 20 to 30% of our pumps are sitting at rest. And they're only inserted into the secretory canalicular membrane when acid secretion is being stimulated. And this is why we recommend that patients should take their PPI half to 1 hour before the first meal of the day. There's the cephalic phase of digestion then, which sets gastrin going, and that then inserts these pumps, activates, switches them on, and inserts them into the secretory canalicular membrane. And so there, just before breakfast, you've taken the drug pH of 4 or above for 70% of the time. 30% of the time, therefore, they would be below. And this is an indication of the fact that even though these drugs are very powerful and can control acid secretion remarkably effectively, they can't do it when we want them to do it. And that's because of the nature of their pharmacology. We can consider that there's some unmet therapeutic needs in reflux disease that we're all experiencing, and that's the need for consistent and reliable symptomatic response in all patients with both erosive and non-erosive disease. And we particularly want it on the first 3 days, because the PPIs take time to accumulate and start to have effect. We need to improve control during the night time. And as I've shown you can't tell when you look at the symptom profile. We know that an intragastric pH below 4 predicts the recurrence of esophagitis. We've shown that on a number of occasions. 40% are unhealed in 4 weeks in grade C, and 60% unhealed with grade D disease. You'll see when you or heal or eradication. So these are off-label indications. And the extraordinary thing is that 20 years after the introduction of the PPIs, they're still being marketed as one drug once a day for all acid-related disorders. And we are now in an era of pH effect. But I think one of the most important characteristics of this drug is the fact that it is not dependent upon food for dosing as Dexamethasone, which you can't see direct comparisons. But you can see here for the nighttime period, when you give the dose in terms of the fact that when it loses its effect, which is after about 5 hours. It's important also to remember with a regular PPI dose that if you increase a single dose, it has little effect. If you want to get better effect with delayed release PPI, this is the paper that many of you may be familiar with, and the methods that we actually use, which I don't intend to go through, except to say that there are a number of criticisms about the approach. Colleagues actually carry out direct laryngoscopy on the patients that they see, so that we don't really know how good this information is. But we do know that they've been described by some workers that what the frequency is not clear. Overall, PPI treatment of patients with the extraesophageal reflux symptoms have been shown to be only marginally effective. But we have to be careful because most studies aren't comparable because of differences in the patient group, and that we may need to use higher doses of PPIs. And interestingly, a survey looking at the practice of ENT physicians and gastroenterologists showed that amongst ENT physicians, about 3/4 of them reported that they made the diagnosis more on symptoms than on laryngeal signs, and they started treatment most often with a PPI once daily for 2 months. They felt that 62% of ENT physicians reported a response rate of greater than 60%. Gastroenterologists were somewhat different. Half of them reported testing with upper GI endoscopy followed by pH monitoring before treatment, while the remaining half reported treating empirically with a PPI twice daily, but for 12 weeks, so a month longer than the ENT. More of the gastroenterologists reported treatment responses of less than 60%. So in general, I think gastroenterologists were trying a bit harder to get objective evidence of the condition, but were finding treatments were disappointing. So in summary here, that where the PPIs are often effective, were in patients with non-cardiac chest pain, patients with GERD-related arrhythmias, sleep disorders and dental erosions. And where the treatments are less effective are in GERD-related asthma, in chronic cough, and in LPR and associated globus. And most of these people are using some add-on medication, which is usually a prokinetic, such as etopride or domperidone or something like that. Now, in Europe and North America, we don't have access to many of the prokinetics, which you do. The one that we're using these days is prucalopride, which was developed for chronic constipation, but which also has quite pronounced effects in the upper GI tract. It's not restricted to the large bowel. But the problem is, of course, if it's effective in the upper GI tract, it may give patients who are not constipated loose stools, so not particularly helpful. So let's just take a last look in this talk to the business of the use of the new drugs, the potassium channel blocking drugs. Here is the potassium channel here. Here is where the PPIs work on the hydrogen potassium ATPase. Here we have the potassium channel, which is blocked by the potassium channel acid blocking drugs. And the difference between these and the PPIs that the PCABs act directly. They're protonated in a similar way. Let's look at these here on the right, the most difficult, 4-week treatment and 8-week treatment. And you can see that we've got healing rates in C after 4 weeks at 96%, and in C and D, and at 99% after 8 weeks. These are dramatic results in comparison with what we see with the current dosing with PPIs. Patient subgroups have a suboptimal response to the first generation PPIs, especially patients who have symptoms in the latter part of the day and at night. Novel formulations of PPIs and the introduction of the PCAB class provide the opportunity to tailor treatment for reflux disease. These also offer opportunity to optimize treatments for NSAID-associated ulcer disease, upper GI bleeding, and the eradication of H. pylori infection. So these drugs are really offering us choices to allow us to take a more individualized approach of the treatment of people with these disorders. So thank you for your attention with that. The fact is that this is an important global infection which kills more than 1 million people a year. About 300,000 dying from peptic ulcer directly related to HP infection. And 750,000 dying from gastric cancer. That about 660,000 gastric cancer cases in 2008 were attributable to H. pylori. And these are about 5% of the 12.5 million cancers worldwide. That's 12.5 million cancers of all organs worldwide. Recently, the evidence that the immunoblot is more sensitive than the ELISA for H. pylori antibodies. Recent prospective studies were combined and pooled estimates were applied to calculate the attributable fraction for H. pylori in non-cardiac gastric cancer and to the global burden. And the worldwide attributable fraction for H. pylori infection in non-cardiac gastric cancer was increased as a result of recalculating this information from 75% to almost 90%. That means, in terms of hard figures, that about 120,000 cases of non-cardiac gastric cancer are attributable to H. pylori infection from about 780,000 cases. So it's gone up from to 6.2% versus 5.2% of all cancers. So this is a very important malignancy, as you know, but in which H. pylori is assuming almost the sole responsibility on a global basis. And while most of us don't think that this is because the organism itself is carcinogenic, it's that it sets the scene for a whole variety of other environmental factors that are common to our lifestyle and diet worldwide. There are a number of relevant publications that have been published in the last 4 or 5 years that I'd just like to draw your attention to because we are limited in time as to how much we can really cover. And the first is the Kyoto Global Consensus on H. pylori gastritis, and a paper that I was involved with which looks at the stomach in health and disease and looks at many aspects of the research interests in the stomach in relation to everything from infection, the microbiome and gastric cancer, but also to things like diet and dyspepsia. There's been a big shift, obviously, away from conditions that are as simple as gastric and duodenal ulcer to a lot of areas in which inflammation is involved in changing digestive tract function and so on. The key messages from the Kyoto Consensus, which I've mentioned, are that H. pylori gastritis is an infectious disease, and that H. pylori gastritis is a specific entity or one of the many causes of dyspepsia. And this has important implications in terms of how we grade it and risk stratify gastritis. Typically people 20 years ago would have said that gastritis and they would have kind of ignored it. The recommendation now is that H. pylori eradication is undertaken early in adulthood in anybody who has gastritis before the development of pre-neoplastic lesions. And so whether that's going to be an acceptable recommendation here in Vietnam, I think is obviously up to local societies and associations to decide on how the H. pylori guideline be modified in the light of this kind of recommendation. But these were incorporated into subsequent consensus statements that have been published within the last 3 years. The Toronto Consensus and the Maastricht 5 Florence Consensus. They took into account the findings of the Kyoto Consensus. And more recently, literally 3 weeks ago, in Taipei, a consensus conference has looked at screening and eradication of H. pylori for gastric cancer prevention. And Chai-Ming Miao kindly gave me some of the information which they discussed at that meeting. And you'll see that they've recommended population-wide screening and eradication of H. pylori. That this should be integrated and included in the national healthcare priorities to optimize resources. And that had a very high agreement, 92%, although the actual evidence for implementing this is still relatively low and based largely upon the successes of other screening and treatment programs such as those for hepatitis B and C. And of course, as you all know, the hepatitis B program that was initiated in Taiwan was, I think, one of the first which has been extremely successful in terms of both screening and treatment effectiveness. They also recommend surveillance of local antibiotic resistance for H. pylori to identify the optimal empiric therapy for mass eradication of H. pylori in the particular population. And that, as I understand it, would be a major challenge here in Vietnam, where you have such a high rate of resistance to particularly clarithromycin. The reinfection rate after H. pylori eradication is fortunately very low, and this means that screening and treatment programs are practical. And appropriately as well, they recommended that a confirmatory test of eradication would not be mandatory as part of mass screening. That they should confirm tests in subsets of the population to ensure that there was an acceptable level of efficacy of the regime that they had implemented. Other points that they raised were that they confirmed the evidence, which is moderate, that eradication of H. pylori does reduce the risk of gastric cancer. And we'll show you that in just a moment. That eradication of H. pylori following resection of early gastric cancer is also recommended because it is known to reduce metachronous cancer rates. And screening and eradication of H. pylori for gastric cancer prevention is recommended in population, particularly with a high incidence or high risk of gastric cancer. And they recommend screening and eradication before the development of atrophic gastritis and intestinal metaplasia. So these were all good recommendations based on reasonable evidence. In terms of screening and treating for gastric cancer prevention in high-risk individuals and in high-risk areas, selecting the population for H. pylori screening is clearly very important. I don't know whether you know enough about the incidence of gastric cancer in this country to identify that you have pockets where the rates are higher. But I think Professor Duke told me that they tend to be higher in the north and they tend to be higher in cities than they do in the rural population, which is the case in many countries in Asia. The geographical demands are going to be highly variable, and that does require one to know a lot more about the epidemiology of both the target disease and the sequel, in this case, gastric cancer as a sequel of a high prevalence of H. pylori. And here there's also the issue of whether you've got an M1S1 with high malignant potential as a key strain. Here's evidence from the literature. It's actually a study from my own group, where you can see that in these large studies that were looking at H. pylori eradication to reduce gastric cancer, that there is a highly significant reduction in this group of just over 3,000 patients. And this has been replicated by others. And in fact, one of the, you can see that there's a highly significant reduction here. But there's also this important study from Yunchu County in Japan, where a total of 185,000 residents aged between 25 and 54 were enrolled in a study and received a diagnosis with 13 carbonuria breath tests, but H. pylori prevalence was 57%. And the H. pylori participants were assigned to two groups, 10-day quadruple anti-H. pylori treatment or look-alike placebos together with a single dose of omeprazole and bismuth. And a total of 94,000 subjects completed the treatment. And 72.9% responded. Somehow I put a Vietnamese translation in my last line there, which is rather nice. Please don't ask me to pronounce this. I'd like to turn now and just say a little bit about treatments, because it doesn't matter which country you're in the world, there is a decrease in the efficacy of our standard H. pylori eradication treatments. And most countries are using a PPI-based triple therapy until recently. And the reasons are resistance to antibiotics, particularly clarithromycin, levofloxacin, and metronidazole. But there are also issues of compliance. You know, a triple therapy is quite complicated for many patients, and doctors are not very good about explaining to the patient how they should take the treatment. And you know, there's no hurry to take H. pylori treatment once you prescribe it. And I always say to patients, it's really important that they take a 2-week period in which they're not doing anything else. They shouldn't be doing it, you know, when they're getting married or they're going to a really important family festival or celebration. They need to do it when they're at home, nothing else is going on, and if they don't feel good and they're getting a sense of nausea or the English word we use is the collywobbles. When you've got gurgling in your stomach, you're feeling a bit uncomfortable, you're not sure whether you want to vomit or have diarrhea. You can stay at home, perhaps take a day off work, but take the treatment and take it properly according to the instructions. So compliance is absolutely critical, and it's up to each of us to ensure that our patients understand the treatment and how to take it, and the implications of failing to get a cure. There have always been the questions of whether the bacterial load is important, and if people have a very heavy infection, whether this is more difficult to eradicate, whether some strains are actually more difficult to eradicate than others. We suspect these things may be important, but we don't have the evidence. And then there's the question of high gastric acidity, and I'm going to say a little bit more about acid in a moment, because acid is critically important within the treatment and how we understand it. The bacterial antibiotic resistance is hugely variable on a regional basis, and clarithromycin has been rapidly increasing in many countries over the past decade, rates as high as 30% in Japan and Italy, 50% in parts of China, 40% in Turkey, 22% in Jordan. They tend to be much lower in Sweden and Taiwan, at around 15%, which is where the cutoff usually is for us to decide whether to use it or not. Other antibiotics show similar trends, particularly things like levofloxacin. But here you can see the global increase that's been going on since the early 90s. And of course, with clarithromycin, this is a general macrolide resistance. So in countries where it doesn't have to be just clarithromycin, which is the issue, many countries are using other macrolides like azithromycin, and you'll get cross-resistance for all of these. So this is a real problem. That is what has tended to drive consensus groups to recommending bismuth quadruple treatments. And here you'll see a meta-analysis of bismuth quadruple versus clarithromycin triple therapy for H. pylori infection. Here you see 2000 to 205, where the triple therapy in blue is similar to the bismuth quadruple therapy in terms of eradication rates, about 79%. But you'll see that was 2000 to 205, but if you now look at 2006 to 2011, you'll see that the PPI-based triple therapy is reducing in efficacy down to 60%. And in some parts of the world, it's probably lower than that, whereas the bismuth quadruple has stayed very effective. So the bismuth-based quadruple, which is involves a PPI and bismuth, metronidazole, and tetracycline, PPI plus 3 antibiotics concomitantly, and longer duration of treatment, 14 days is always recommended now with whatever treatment. And if you can, and you know what your antimicrobial susceptibilities are, you try and tailor the combinations to do that. But these have all been ways that people have used for trying to improve eradication. And the other question is the use of increasing acid inhibition with high doses of PPI, and considering very high dose PPI or one of the new anti-secretory drugs with amoxicillin in order to try and get a simpler and much cheaper eradication therapy. But the more powerful use of acid-suppressing drugs is of considerable interest, and I'll just come to that in just a moment. Here is bismuth-based quadruple therapy. This is using a single capsule with all of the drugs in one capsule. It was unfortunately a very large capsule, more suitable for horses than patients. But you can see here, carrier resistance was quite effectively overcome in the case of using the quad therapy, which is shown in purple, whereas it was not at all effective when the OAC, omeprazole, amoxicillin, clarithromycin alone was used, which is the yellow-gold color. So you can tend to overcome resistance if you're using bismuth therapy. In areas of high resistance, that's considered above 15%, bismuth quadruple or non-bismuth quadruple. Sorry. In areas where the clarithromycin resistance is greater than 15%, bismuth quadruple or non-bismuth quadruple with concomitant PPI and 3 antibiotics have been recommended. in areas of high dual clarithromycin and metronidazole resistance, the bismuth quadruple is the recommended first line of treatment. And these were the latest recommendations from the most recent Maastricht group conference. The treatment for 14 days also recommended. You can see that the eradication rates with OBMT, clarithromycin resistance, is actually not an issue. Metronidazole resistance is also virtually irrelevant because you've got OBMT in blue here, superior to the PPI triple therapy in yellow for all of these. So OBMT, while it's a difficult treatment for patients to manage because of the large number of pills, it is very effective, but it does mean that we as physicians need to be very careful to counsel the patients about how important it is that they take every single tablet in order to get these really very respectable results. You can see here at 95 and 91% respectively. What about acid control then for H. pylori eradication? Again, these are unmet needs in H. pylori treatments at the moment. We need consistent and reliable eradication rates in all patients, and by consistency, we're aiming to try and get between 90 and 95% eradication. We need prolonged control of acid secretion, particularly at night, because most of these antibiotics are acid labile and easily destroyed in gastric juice. Eradication rates are lower in patients with nocturnal acid breakthrough, so we know that acid can interfere with eradication. And we also know that eradication treatments require potent acid suppression at high dose and frequency, and that slow metabolizers actually get more effective eradication than rapid metabolizers. So we have some reasons for all of this. You can see here, you want to get the pH in the stomach up to between pH 5 and 7, preferably 6 or above, because you want the H. pylori organisms to be in replicative state. You want them to be turning over rapidly and growing rapidly, because if they're growing, they are going to be more susceptible to the antibiotic than if they're just sitting quietly at rest, which is what happens to them when the pH falls. They go into a vegetative state and don't replicate. So by getting the pH higher with a good anti-secretory drug, the treatment we give then is going to hit them much harder. So this is what we're aiming at. And H. pylori enters the replicative state when the pH is above 6. And above the pH of 6, amoxicillin and clarithromycin in particular last much longer. It doesn't degrade. So we are trying to get to a pH of 6. And we know that twice or more daily PPI is superior to once daily PPI in triple therapy, and that those who are slow metabolizers, as I said a little earlier, eradicate more effectively. And in fact, some PPIs have been shown to have antibacterial activity against H. pylori in vitro. But whether this is relevant in this situation, we actually don't know. But Dr. Furuta in Japan has looked at multiple dosing with PPIs, and this is a study with lansoprazole 30 milligrams 4 times a day, shown here in the closed circles. And you'll see that that pH is above 6 for most of the day, or most of the whole 24-hour period, including at night. And so this is one particular way that we could do this. And I've certainly increased the frequency of dosing of the PPIs in these cases myself. And you can see the importance again of acid in this particular study. This was the original MAP2 study, which showed the principle of the importance of acid. Amoxicillin and clarithromycin alone only 26% eradication, but when you add the anti-secretory drug, and this is 20 years ago, the eradication rate was 94%. Well, sadly, we're nowhere near 94% now with this triple therapy, but it shows just how important the acid is. So what happens when we use the PCAB, where I showed you the dramatic results in the treatment of erosive GERD? Here we have vonoprazan 20 BID and Lanzo 30 BID, and you can see in unselected patients with H. pylori infection, 93% compared with lansoprazole 76%,